Okay, so thank you very much for coming. So we started academic 15 minutes, and I will present a paper which is already written on the concept. So did you start to, where is Mariana, to record? It has disappeared. Okay.
I believe so.
It is this paper has a particular history which is perhaps interesting for you to situate what was the research question. I am organizing a special issue of a journal called Forum for Social Economics on the concept of development. So this paper is on the concept of development, not on development issues in general. And in fact, yes, there are some papers before me on the concept of development. And this paper is still intending to be the introduction of the special issues. And it became a real paper because I didn't want to make a simple introduction of 6 or 7 papers. And it is on the concept of development. And as the title is suggesting, this is quite a pessimistic paper on how we can understand today the very concept of development. And I took from Krugman, I will come back to this, the concept of diminished expectations, which I think is extremely relevant as an expression compared to, let's say, 50 years ago, after independence, typically, where the word development was very positively connotated. And so the argument of the paper I will present first is conceptual, theoretical, and starts from a surprise and a paradox. That is, if there is a word which is really normally positively connotated, because it's a theological word, typically, it's development. I mean, development is something which is implicitly conveying the idea of moving from a state of affairs which is supposed to be inferior, we will see in terms of what, values, etc., unachieved, towards something which is better, more positively connotated, desirable, i.e., being developed. So the surprise is the following, that is, typically this word is value loaded, is also theological implicitly, because again, it is suggesting the idea of aim, of a goal, of an objective, etc. It is also a word which is normative, intrinsically normative, which is something, I mean, not so obvious, because being developed is implicitly something which is better than not being developed. Okay. And the paradox and the surprise is that, in fact, the concept of development today, in 2025, in fact, if we take 2 levels, which is the meanings of the concept of development, which I call in a very arrogant French way, is epistemology, and its use, the use of the word development, which is, broadly speaking, the empirical reality to which the concept of development is applied. So meanings and use, in fact, don't display at all. So you see the word, the concept, the meanings and its use don't display the evolutionary trajectory or path which you could expect from such a word. And I will develop this idea. And why I call this evolutionary? I mean, evolutionary in the sense that the phenomena to which the concept of development are referring could converge or serve an objective, a purpose, etc., called being developed or development. We will see absolutely no evolution, no convergence in both the meanings of the word and both the reality to which it is supposed to refer. So this was a surprise, and I will develop a bit this idea. That is, not only there is no evolution, no convergence in both views and meanings, but also normally in any social science, normally there is a past dependence, cumulative knowledge. That is normally anthropology, I will come back here, I don't want to say anything. That is, to take any social science like anthropology, sociology, or whatever. I mean, we don't talk in anthropology today as we were talking in the 19th century. I mean, we don't talk about race, nature, society, etc., as 1 century ago, which is cumulative knowledge. Surprisingly, so which is called past dependence. That is, the state of knowledge today normally takes stock from knowledge 10 years ago, 15 years ago, etc., which is called cumulative knowledge. Improved adequation of the concept to converging to a better understanding of the empirical reality. It's not the case for the world development. So, and this is a surprise which has started this paper. So I have to say that it's a paper, it's not a book. So I'm not making a grand reflection on development in general, like you have plenty of excellent books on that, Meyer and Roche, Todaro, Torbeck, Colin Lace, etc. My precise question is to explain this paradox that is a word which is conveying evolutionary connotation, but in fact, which is my argument, the least incremental, the word conveying the least in social science, incremental improvement regarding its meaning and its empirical application. So what are I developed three levels of explanation of this paradox. So first, the word development is subject to what I call semantic arborescence. And so an arborescence, fissiparity, division, infinite division like cells of its various meanings. So, and not only a fissiparity, which is a very chic word for saying that, look, this is theory, and not only fissiparity, but dilution. So this fissiparity implies also dilution of the various meanings of the concept. And also this dilution has been accelerated by the great number of disciplines which are addressing the word development, not only economics, but of course, other social science. And this discipline, one of the causes of the paradox is that something which is very strange. I mean, if you think seriously about it, that is, you have something like different science, social science, dealing with development, let's say economics, for instance, whatever, history, political science, etc. But you have also a discipline called development studies. So the fact that you have something called development studies exactly in parallel at the same level of economics. So where do you put economics? Normally, economics should be included in development studies, which is not the case, as you know, because of course, economics considers development studies is something absolutely not scientific and not interesting, etc. So this creates a progressive, step-by-step, arborescent fragmentation of the meanings of the concept, and also because all these disciplines are themselves fragmented by subject, areas, Africa, etc., etc. This is the first level of analysis of this fissiparity, if I may say. The second level is something which is quite different. The explanation of this diminished expectation and fissiparity against teleology is that this is a strange concept where its internal validity, that is its epistemology, its scientific status, etc., is quite specific. Development, its meanings, since the beginning, the meanings have been shaped by external entities. And not every concept in social science has been devised and fed by external entities. And I will develop what are the so not by the entities or empirical realities, from the people themselves to which the concept of development was applied, which is really strange, I mean, if we think seriously about it. And so these external entities, we will see what they are. I mean, colonization, of course, then the IFI, etc. But what is really interesting, this is a concept which the meaning is not at all internal validity criteria, but external entities. So, of course, it has an effect on the meaning. So it means that, again, the issue of past dependence in terms of knowledge, cumulative knowledge, etc., where past paradigms are normally the foundation of future paradigms, did not exist for the concept of development, which is my second level of explanation, I would say. So, as I said, colonizer, then the World Bank, IMF, etc. And typically, these external entities have been drivers of normative drivers of prescribers of what is a relevant conceptual framework, relevant framework for understanding the concept of development. And again, not African people or whoever from developing economies. Then the third and last level of entry of analysis, there are other, but I think these three can also explain the Fitzsimmons dynamics, is that in fact the object of the word development, the concept development, that is the population, the countries, societies, etc. This object, empirical object, in fact, itself, this is something you know, but I think it's worth to analyze, has completely dissolved. That is, the grouping, for instance, the society's population to which the word is applied has completely evolved, varied, etc., over time, over, let's say, 1 century. And how did they evolve? First, the grouping have fluctuated, evolved, etc., and always driven by geopolitical and political, economic, I mean, different degrees. So typically, third world, etc., emerging, whatever, we will come to this. So, which is adding to the issue, which is not only lack of convergence, lack of past dependence, etc., but what I call dissolution. That is the groupings to which the concept is attached, referring to, these groupings have dissolved. And why they have dissolved? Because in fact, the institutions, the various institutions which are addressing, using the word development, in fact, typically international organizations, United Nations, World Bank, IMF, etc., have their own groupings. And these groupings are not identical. So we have something which is really interesting, I think. The institutionalized groupings, the international organizations which have institutionalized these different groupings, are using different criteria, WTO, UN, World Bank, etc., and sometimes overlapping, but sometimes not overlapping. So, which is, I think, something quite important, and we will see in detail. So, the argument is, as I said, to summarize the argument, more Fitzsimmons dynamics than theological connotation, which is strange for such a word. And second, something really strange for me, I mean, quite surprising, that is contrary to other social science concepts, which is really like nature, society, man, etc. Again, we don't talk about what is a human being or whatever today as in the 19th century, because I don't know, neurology, paleontology, archaeology, etc. All these sciences have completely changed the meaning of the concept. Not for the word development, which has not witnessed any, let's say, revolution à la Kuhn, no epistemic change of paradigm, which is really something I think worth noting. So I develop now the first point, So what I call the disintegration of the meanings of development over time, rather than evolutionary process, evolutionary dynamics improvement, and as I insist, at the theoretical level and at the empirical level. So polysemy, fragmentation, fissiparity, etc. So as I said, normally normative from a low level underdeveloped, low level development, etc., towards something which is desirable. And how did it happen? So to put it quickly, this concept, which is describing a dynamic from level A inferior to level B superior, has been first developed by quite a few thinkers since, let's say, the Second World War, which has been the seminal period of the foundation of the concept, so Sir Arthur Lewis, Gunnar Myrdal, Hirschman, and many others. But all these people, as you know, people working on development, had extremely different views of what is development. But also something which is recent now. I mean, the books are quite recent, 2020, 2024. Now we discover that also, in fact, quite a few economists from developing, so-called developing economies, let's say India, etc., had their own views of development. So the book by Maria Bach, for instance, is on Indian economists in the 19th century, completely overlooked, completely forgotten, which right from the beginning started to say to the Raj, to the British Empire, that there are different views of development in India, etc. But in fact, were completely forgotten, overlooked, etc. And so now we have quite a few publications showing that also not only we have this evolution over time from the founding father, Gunnar Myrdal, Arthur Lewis, etc., but also finally different countries produce different academics, different scholars, which had a very different view of what it means, what are the meaning of the word development. So this is the first step of the problem, of the issue. So another issue which has been very instrumental in this fissiparity is the relationship of the word development with the concept of development and growth, with the concept of economic growth. And this concept, I mean, is now, I would say, extremely problematic. So development since Amartya Sen introduced quite a few disturbance, destabilization in the concept of development, because, as everybody knows, Sen insisted in the fact that, regarding the difference development and growth, that development should not be only referring to the improvement of monetary income, but introduce non-monetary dimension. I mean, if you take this seriously, if you read Sen seriously, this is also a first, let's say, foot in the door for the end of the word development. Because Sen, from the very moment we say economic growth is measured, as you know, by GDP per capita or GNI per capita, etc., if, as Sen, you take seriously the stance, the position that monetary poverty, which is mediated by money, is only a means towards a particular end, which are decent standard of living, health, etc. Of course, you introduce extreme destabilization of the concept, because means and ends are not the same. And so what are the goals you pursue as a policymaker, etc., etc. So everybody knows this, but if we take, again, I am an epistemologist, if you take this seriously, that is dignity, for instance, is part of a desirable goal. Of course, where do you put, and it has been a reproach made to Sen quite often, what is a desirable goal as a policy maker? And I insist on that. I will come also to this. In a world of scarce resource, limited resource, and if you are a policy maker, you cannot pursue all goals, and you are obliged to make different choices. And this is path dependent, because if you take a particular choice, we were talking this afternoon about this, health, education, or whatever, you may sacrifice. This is typically because what is a developing country? It is a country which has scarce resource, which is a definition, I would say, not unlimited resource, and immediately it is orthogonal. I mean, a particular policy choice can be completely orthogonal to another one, etc. So a response of observer, I mean, international organization, as everybody knows, to this tension between growth and development has been solved by international institutions, typically the UN, the UNDP, in saying, no problem, we will just add supplementary additional dimension to the concept of development. Let's create the famous sustainable Millennium Development Goals, then the sustainable the SDG development goal, etc. And no problem, it's just a matter of dimension. But if you are a good epistemology, if you try to see, I mean, if there is any logic or feasibility in this, you see that we are entering a very gray area in terms of, let's say, theoretical rigor. That is, what does it mean to have 17 dimensions of development, which is the case today of the SDG, and you can, why not 24 or etc. So then the destabilization has been even worse when Sen introduced, which is accepted today, that democracy, a political state of affairs, typically democracy was a superior state of affairs compared to authoritarian states or dictatorship, etc. Okay, this is very sympathetic, but this is also extremely problematic because it's a dimension which is quite referring to a different world from the economic world, for instance, I mean, political regime, etc. And the aporia of this addition of, you see, dimension are not, to put it otherwise, things you can add, like in a cake with layers of different vanilla, then chocolate, then whatever, because you have a logical relationship between all these dimensions. And the additional destabilization has come when the World Bank typically said it's very sympathetic to introduce democracy and let us impose good governance. Good governance is part of development. There cannot be development without good governance, etc. But the first problem has been to measure that, because this international organization cannot deal with concepts which are not measured with quantitative figures. And to measure democracy, this is an important activity within the World Bank, the IMF, etc. But I can discuss on that later. It is a dead end, absolute dead end, because it's extremely difficult to measure a very loose concept such as democracy. Do you measure it by the number of elections, by the number of journals, etc.? It is, any political scientist know how difficult. I mean, in the US currently, you have incredibly deep and complex discussion about the type of regime, how to qualify the type of regime which is progressively built today in the US, and maybe a new concept, etc. So measuring that is not really something evident. But the second thing, not beyond the measure, is that on all these dimensions, you can have completely contradictory dimension. And I took the example of Rwanda, which is a wonderful example, because Rwanda, for instance, if you take the dimension of Sen political democracy, you can say that Rwanda is not exactly the best model of good development in terms of democracy, because being elected by 99% of voters maybe can introduce some doubts on the quality of the democracy. But at the same time, if you take another indicators, for instance, sociopolitical indicator, which is a very good one, why not, which is the proportion of female members in the parliament, Rwanda is by far ahead of France, whatever, etc. So this is just an example, small example of, even within a particular dimension, which is democracy, you have sub levels. That is, which measure number of women in parliament, proportion of voters for election, etc. And again, so I'm just here for introducing destabilization. So then another element also of dissolution of the concept, fragmentation, and so on, is everything I said before so far was at least keeping that development is a superior state of affairs compared to an inferior state of affairs. Now you have quite many thinkers today which are even refusing the positive connotation of the word development. And you have this line of thought that maybe you already know, Escobar, Makotari, etc., who say, no, development is not a desirable state of affairs, because development, one of the arguments, there are plenty of is this is typically a colonial creation, development, this position of Escobar, and we have to move to what Escobar called a post-development era, and development is not something desirable, which is introducing again another, I would say, hit in the concept, and which is, I mean, today is for 5 years, something quite plausible. That is, these arguments are absolutely strong, and precisely the Indian economists were saying this is something completely created in a certain type of geography, history, etc. And in fact, we should aim towards a state of affairs development completely disconnected from any colonial history. So Escobar is also, which is, I think, something quite strong, that is getting rid of the positive connotation and so on. Then we could say, okay, some hope could come from the so-called heterodox pluralist economists, which could maybe bring some cumulative knowledge, some new coherence in the concept, etc. No, the so-called heterodox currents in economics, so the pluralists, or the people who don't recognize themselves in mainstream neoclassical economics, etc., so-called heterodox, which is they are themselves a grab bag of different currents which don't talk to each other, typically the Marxian, the post-Keynesian, the institutional, and the evolutionary trends, and these people don't exchange, don't even discuss with each other. They use completely different paradigm, hypotheses, and concept. And in fact, what heterodox currents could qualify today, what you see, for instance, at the EP conference every year. In fact, the concept is very interesting because it started from attending this conference, EP. I said, where is development? And development doesn't exist in EP, not at all. And you see the concept which are subsuming, let's say, the exchange between the various heterodox currents are precisely Mariana Mazzucato, that is typically the concept of innovation, the concept of technology, innovation. So what is development for them? It is industrialization, innovation system, technology, and complexity, which is introducing more complexity in the economy. And it started from Rodrik, that even Rodrik, which is not exactly heterodox economist, but is not a mainstream economist, Rodrik made plenty of papers saying that with Ricardo Hausmann at Harvard, with a famous Atlas of Economic Complexity, saying that development is in fact exhibiting a more complex economy than a simple economy. So there is an index of complexity, etc., which is quantified through the number of products and quantity of value added, etc. So you see, even the no help on this side. Then, not only the concept of development has been contested, but the concept of growth. And given the tension was between the concept of development and growth, even the concept of growth itself will not be of any help for building any cumulative knowledge on the concept of development. Because as you know, the concept of growth, which is usually subsumed by GDP per capita, GNI, etc., in fact, is now extremely contested because of climate change, resource depletion, etc., etc. So you have quite a few concepts such as sustainable growth. You have degrowth, of course, which is green growth, which is typically the Commission vocabulary, etc. And let's say that sustainable growth could be associated with degrowth, because degrowth is not, as you know, a decrease in GDP per capita, but it is just a composition which is completely different. But what is interesting is that even the concept of growth itself is completely contested, and also with different indicators, and in fact, these indicators, yesterday I saw a student which is working for the ministry here, former student, and it was very interesting because she was mentioning that there is a department, and I think this is the same in France, in the statistical department, and so on, addressing the issue of green growth or sustainable growth, etc. But in fact, the national accounts still continue, the same in France, the same, to use the good old GDP per capita and GNI and so on. That is, you have parallel knowledge with quite a lot of academics and people and civil servants working on sustainable growth, but in fact, it is not informing the traditional use and even at the World Bank, etc. And these parallel activities are quite interesting, and I think supporting my argument of epistemic, yes, what I call epistemic fractionalization. Yes, it's already half an hour, so I have to accelerate if I can, because I will. So another issue which is also, but thank you for another element of this fragmentation of the concept of growth. As you know, you have somebody, an economist called Easterlin, who has introduced the famous paradox of Easterlin, so the concept of happiness, so Nepal, Bhutan, etc. And the Easterlin paradox is that there is no correlation between feeling welfare, I mean feeling well, being happy, etc., and economic growth. So, which is also a big issue, and I think also to take seriously. So, fractionalization, epistemic fractionalization, semantic decoupling, etc., complexification of the concept. Another issue is okay. So now this is a state of affairs, but these descriptions, by definition, they are associated to policies. By definition, if you qualify a particular concept, normally it leads, it drives, it commands certain type of policies. So my point is to say, okay, this state of affairs is making that this complexification, fragmentation affects also the policies supposed to drive better development. And the point, something you know, but I am, you see, reorganizing all this knowledge, that is, the policies, in fact, are also completely fragmented. Yes, fragmented, dissolved, etc., reflecting the conception of development I was describing before. And you have this beautiful sentence by Irma Adelman, which I quote, that nothing has more varied in time than policies, views and policies on how to develop. And the point is exactly the same. This improvement, these policies varied over time, but not driven by improvement. That is, okay, you can say how can describe improvements or efficiency, etc. This is another debate. And there is no taking stock in terms of policies regarding development. So after the Second World War, as you know, the policies corresponding to definition of development, typically state intervention is necessary. Then we got freedom of markets cause growth. Then, I mean, at the same time, industrial policies cause growth. Then, a bit later, you will recognize who was saying that industrial policies are costly distortion, etc., etc. So typically, the World Bank during the austerity, etc. So it means that also the policies, which is the second pillar of constitutional development, did not follow any evolutionary incremental path. That is, waves, as you said, Alexandre, waves of state And the point is typically the state has been the criterion where dissent appeared. So state intervention positive at the time of the Second World War. Then in the 80s, typically World Bank, etc., IFI, state bad, etc. Now a bit of Stiglitz, Roderick, etc. State is back, etc., etc. So developmental state in Asia. So just to say that we have no movement again that is which is based on something which has happened before, which could be helpful for producing in the future something even in the world of policy more efficient. You see, as I said, in the world of theories, not even something which is more true between quotation marks, more adequate, more congruent to the concept, but even in the term of policy, nothing which is incremental. So no cumulative knowledge, etc. And this is really strange because, as I mentioned before, this is absolutely unique. That is, take any other social science, anthropology is typically a normal social science where, again, the concept have known some incremental progress in terms of adequate description of reality. We don't talk, again, about progress or race or whatever as in the 19th century, because anthropology has absorbed all the knowledge of archaeology, linguistics, etc. And now anthropology is aware of all this, and we can imagine. So history exactly the same, etc. In economics, development economics is very strange because in fact you have movement back forward. That is, John Toy has made a book called The Counter Revolution in Economics. It was related to the IFI, to the IMF, to the neoliberalism underlying IFI program in the 80s. And I think the word of counter-revolution is really describing what has taken place, which is really going back compared to, let's say, the Second World War, where all the founding fathers were quite reasonable people and saying, you need state intervention, you need industrialization, etc. So something completely unique to social science. Another, and I finish this section here, another issue is also that if we remain at the level of policy, something which is also very strange and very worrying in terms of epistemic status is that if we analyze policies, depending on the meaning of the paradigm where you situate your own analysis, you will not analyze failures of success the same. That is, for instance, if you are somebody considering that good development is a degrowth development, you will consider that, like in Portugal, the sales of cars or the quantity of cement produced, which is typically a proxy for development. You see, the more cars you sell, the better. The more cement you produce, the more the construction sector is in a good shape, etc. But if you have a different definition, you would say, oh my God, the quantity of cars sold is an absolute disaster, you see, I mean, for pollution, etc. So the incredible difficulty is there. That is, the criterion of success for, let's say, a national accountant, etc., which will say, okay, Portugal is in a better shape because the quantity of, etc., cars sold is good, will consider as a criterion of failure if you have a completely different. Again, everybody knows this, but I think that it is really something which is unique for the world, development and so on. So here I am accelerating. This fragmentation has been intensified by the fact that various disciplines address the concept of development. So this semantic arborescence is accelerated, intensified by the fact that which discipline is competent, appropriate for analyzing development. So of course, economics, these founding fathers So I could find, I mean, mainstream economics, of course, and not all economics. The founding fathers were economists, Myrdal, Louis, etc. But and in fact, they were economists, and after mainstream economics put its flag very firmly on the domain of development, saying we are the competent discipline, the other are qualitative, they don't know anything scientific, etc. So the famous economic imperialism of economics. Okay, but other social science, say anthropology typically, or history, or political science, say, sorry, I mean, you economists, you don't know anything adequate, relevant for understanding development, and anthropologists are quite assertive in saying we are the only discipline having something serious to say. Ferguson, etc., the famous book by Ferguson, to analyze what is development. Political science, of course, political economy, of course, say you economists, you are completely superficial, you don't know anything. So the point is to say that you have different disciplines claiming more competence with different tools, different methodology. And not only this, but the strange fact that you have the development studies subdiscipline, which is claiming that they know better than all other disciplines, because development studies normally includes everything, including ecology, etc. And the problem, economics being as arrogant and imperialist as usual, economics has decided right from the beginning, and you can see in universities, it is very visible in universities, the Department of Development Studies never talk to the Department of Economics. It's not even possible to have, because they consider that development studies is a completely uncertain, unrigorous discipline which has no scientific dimension. So, which is, of course, accelerating the fragmentation. Fragmentation is also accelerated by the fact that each discipline is itself fragmented. That is, macroeconomics, for instance, has very little relationship with microeconomics, and the authors and studies used, let's say, by monetary economics are absolutely not common to the author and studies used by another subdiscipline of the economics. I don't know the author in monetary or financial economics. I mean, it's a completely different domain from, let's say, development economics, so which is also an issue. And today, what is under the competence of development has been captured completely by RCT, by development microeconomics, which is really a specific subdiscipline with a specific methodology, typically surveys, randomized control, etc. Which means something which is important for myself, that is, what is important, what was important in the Second World War, the big picture. I mean, the people at the Second World War had the big picture at the time before decolonization, etc. I like the metaphor of pointillisme. I don't know if you know the painting Pointillisme. You say pointillisme after the impressionism. And pointillists were all saying, if you go too close to the painting, you will not see it. And you have to be a bit, let's say, 5 meters far from the painting to see the. And I think this metaphor is really relevant here. That is, if we want to understand what is at stake, we have not to. We cannot see the big picture if we are too close to, let's say, a micro study, etc. Then all these disciplines have their own methodology. Another disaster. So their own methodology, that is, and typically, if you believe, like me, that the methodology today creates the discipline, that is, mathematization has really created economics of today, and economics of today, you are an economist if you have a model in your paper. That is, the methodology has created the belonging. You see, you are in or out if you can exhibit a particular methodology. Even Ravi Kambour was made a very interesting paper a few months ago in in European Journal of Development Research, is very strict and saying, given it is a methodology which is defining the discipline, in this case, development economics doesn't exist anymore. And the position of Cambourg is to say, and François Bourguignon and many of them, is to say, in fact, let's remove the word development economics. There is only one economics, because the very fact that you use a model and econometrics define you as an economist. And if you don't use this methodology, you are not an economist. So you see, the methodology is also accelerating the disintegration. And then another element of the disintegration is, of course, that is which indicator of what you talk about are you taking quantitative indicators, which is used in economics, but development studies, which is important, they say no, quantitative indicators are completely irrelevant. Let us use biographies. And now biographies, which is a science because you have software for analyzing biographies, etc. Case study, you have quite a war even within the World Bank, which is quite important between case studies and econometrics. And I work at the World Bank doing, and it is also something which is producing completely different results and views. Okay, so that's it. Then external entities. So I have already announced on what was the second pillar of my argument, that is, strangely, the concept of development, in fact, has been devised consistently over time by external entities. Of course, and of course the policy as well. Of course, colonization, I like the expression of David Harvey. How can we define colonization? Accumulation by dispossession, so which is quite a beautiful expression. And in fact, you see immediately that the issue of dispossession has been absolutely intrinsic in the definition of, colonial, let's say, colonial dynamics. But what I'm not insisting on this because it's not a paper on colonization, but I just wanted to say that right from the beginning, this has been a spot, a task in the concept of development, which has to be taken seriously. But then we have different actors, different entities participating in the building of the concept, but always external. And so, of course, not only colonizer and so on, but for instance, after independence, as you know, perhaps, many countries, Ghana, for instance, is very well known, called heterodox economists, typically John Robinson, Nicolas Caldor, etc. In fact, government wanted good economists from the West to help them. And these were Keynesian, by the way. It has not been always, let's say, mainstream neoclassical economists, but it stopped very quickly in Ghana, because of the collapse of Ghanaian economy after Nkrumah, etc. And it has been, I would say, it was sympathetic to call, let's say, Keynesian economists, but in fact, they were also external. They were just external advisor of the government, and then coming back to the UK, etc. And then, of course, enter the IFI, the World Bank, and the IMF as penetrating the administration, the civil service, and the policy making of indebted developing countries. So everybody knows this. I can be quite quick. And typically, you have plenty of paper entitled "Devised in Washington, D.C." So policies were devised in Washington, and I've been sometime part of this. It was really like in a movie, that is, 20 people coming from Washington, settling in the Ministry of Finance, and then writing the memorandum of understanding, etc. Why is it interesting for my purpose? It is because this institution don't have the advancement of knowledge as a main purpose. You can be critical or not against the IFI. It's not my main activity. But what is interesting for my argument is the fact that these entities don't have cumulative knowledge as their goal. The goal of the World Bank, it's a bank, or the IMF, the monetary institution, is not academic improvement of knowledge. They have a department of research which is excellent. No problems, they have the best economists and so on. But we remain in this building of the concept of development shaped by institution where the goal of this institution is not academic research and understanding better adequacy of a concept. And so they act as prescriber of the theoretical paradigm through the relation of credit. The credit relationship, of course, has meant that everybody in the world, in developing economies, has been obliged to produce papers, etc., within the paradigm of the World Bank, because again, the World Bank was at the same time a credit institution, a financing institution through conditionality, policy conditionality, and that's it. And if, in fact, it has been very serious because the type of framework, theoretical framework by this external entity, IFI, typically what came in the 80s, liberalization called growth, deficit are bad for growth, etc., has become something which has become, epistemologically speaking, a truth. And this is why it matters, because again, it was not disputable, because again, this institution were lenders and had an asymmetric position where it could not be discussed. And the problem is that this institution, as everybody knows, had fads, fashions, etc., created their own paradigm. And as you know, it has been in the 80s, social adjustment, etc. Then it became poverty reduction. Then it became, in the 2000s, inclusive growth. Then it became addressing vulnerability, etc. That is, given IFI as external entities were not focused on advancing knowledge, it has opened a Pandora box of producing a lot of so-called scientific concepts which are not scientific at all, but just following different type of paradigm, like yes, poverty, etc. The UN, and it's not only the IFI. I mean, we should not say that the scapegoat is only the World Bank and the IMF. The United Nations produced exactly the same, and they introduced, and they said development is not an issue anymore 20 years ago, and they said what is important is social change. So everybody started to work on social change as the goal to achieve. Then social change disappeared 2 or 3 years ago, and it became, through the UN, transformative change, which is not exactly the same as social change, etc. So just to insist on that, what is important is in this asymmetric relationship of the credit relationship is that the government, the recipient, African government, developing countries government, etc., in fact, lack the human resources in terms of academics, in terms of research, to present alternative with internal validity frameworks. First, because they don't have the academic resource, the universities, etc., but also for the famous political economy that everybody knows, that is, if they want to be recognized as serious international economists, they have to be published in academic journal, international academic journal, where they have to talk this language. That is, they absolutely cannot produce a completely different framework because they would not be accepted as valid interlocutors by, let's say, experts from the IMF, etc. That is, it's both in terms of resources, human resource, and also in terms of language. If you want to be invited in Washington, D.C., or published in American Economic Review, you have to adopt exactly the same language, concept, etc. Then, quickly, because everybody knows this, then the paradigm external entities were also the bilateral aid entity. As everybody knows, bilateral aid Portuguese aid, French aid, etc., is not really made for developing. I mean, this is what is called the aid industry has been criticized by thousands of papers highlighting that development donor, the aid industry is not for aiming to develop the recipient countries, but for addressing the interest of the donors, and it is even recognized by the World Bank, the IMF, etc. It is something which is, of course, one of the explanation of the failure of aid, and there is a famous paradox, the so-called Samaritan dilemma, and recipient countries, knowing that it is corresponding to the interests of donor, are of course not at all doing what is supposed to be the conditionality, etc., which is and doing whatever they wish, which is, by the way, increasing the inefficiency of the device. And I finish this section in quoting Angus Deaton, which is a great economist and got the Nobel Prize in Economics, Bank of Sweden Prize. And I think this is a very strong sentence. So Deaton made a book 10 years ago. I forgot the title, but look at this sentence. The givers and receivers of aid, the government in both countries are allied against their own people. And so it is not an extreme left person writing this. It is Angus Deaton, who is really one of the greatest economists of the 20th, 21st century. All that change from colonial times is the nature of what is being extracted, and it is not possible to develop somewhere else from the outside. And I think it's a. And how much minutes now? I'll finish the last section.
How long has it been?
I have the last section, so 10 minutes is okay? Yeah. So the last section is to say what I was saying before, that is, the empirical object has also dissolved. That is the groupings. And so this section is just highlighting that we moved from a very simple world after the Second World War, where we had nicely the underdeveloped and the developed. So it was simple, binary, everything was okay, etc. Then, as everybody knows, in the 50s, 60s, and etc., plenty of new groupings, criteria, description appeared as a third word: underdeveloped, emerging, transition, global south, today, etc., which you may notice are all normative expression, by the way. Then you had dualism, which proliferated, like periphery versus the centre, the rest versus the west, Alice Samson. Then different theories and qualification coming from highlighting more asymmetries. So the dependencia school, the structuralist, then development of underdevelopment, more asymmetry, unequal exchange, peripheral capitalism, etc. So you see a proliferation of qualification and groupings and categories. Yes, different categories within the category or outside the category, which has accelerated the dissolution of the empirical reference of the concept. You see which type of countries are covered by this concept, and the acceleration has been aggravated by the fact that international organization, IFI, decided to create their own groupings. And so the IFI, World Bank, and the IMF, instead of using developing versus developed or whatever, they currently use something low-income countries, as you know, and lower middle-income countries. And in fact, the two categories refer to what we ordinarily consider as developing economies, which they oppose to a third category, which is upper middle income and high income. Okay, so there are four categories, and these categories are extremely important because they command the terms of debt. I mean, all the terms of debt relief, etc., are commanded by in which category you are. So if you are in low income, you have debt relief, which is concessional, which is not the case if you are upper middle income, let's say Nigeria or whatever. So this is the World Bank beginning of introducing more confusion. Then you have also IFI, IMF and World Bank. They decided to create another category, which is advanced economies versus emerging markets and developing economies. And so if you read the IMF literature, they use M2, which is very strange, because in M2, can you imagine, you have the whole world without, except the advanced country, emerging plus developing. And again, if you read the IMF annual report, and with all the figure correlation, the mathematical model, and so on, it is MDs correlated with whatever, climate change, etc. Then the IMF, another income, I think it's really funny, poetry. Then the IMF created another criterion, which is low-income developing economies, LDICs, versus emerging market and middle-income economies, MEs. And what are they? Those emerging market economies which are not classified as the first one. You see, like informal sector, which is everything which is not formal. So a kind of completely tautological classification. Then the IMF use also the IDA category. That is, IDA is the International Development Association, which is financing poor countries. This is really, really important. I mean, it is financing the 3/4 of Africa, etc. And IDA also create, but IDA is not only like the other category, only with the criterion of GNI per capita, it is also political. That is, it's absolutely open that some countries can be integrated in IDA because they cannot borrow on international markets, which has nothing to do with GNI per capita. So, which means that in IDA, you have Nigeria and Pakistan. I mean, you can say this is not. So then the vulnerable, etc. Then the United Nations use a different classification. I mean, it is worse too. And the United Nations use developed economies, economic in transition, and developing economies. And also developing regions. What are they? All countries of Africa, excluding Japan, so it's completely ad hoc. You see, that is all Asia, but you withdraw Japan and South Korea. Everything in Latin America, but you remove Australia, etc. So this is the United Nations. I insist. So UNCTAD, etc. Then the UN has created a new classification, which is the least developed countries. You know the LDC, and you have heard about the LDC. So LDCs, which are not only LDCs, so the poorest of the poor, but they added landlocked developing countries. So you have the LDC landlocked, and the small island, which is another category, the small island developing state. All this is not a joke, because if you are a LDC, typically for the EU, for the Commission, you benefit imports in the EU free of duty. That is, many countries struggle for being, and they cheat on the demography, etc., because of course the GNI per capita, for remaining LDC, because it's extremely interesting to be LDC, especially for the EU. Why is it also important? It is important because being in a category, I insist, gives you particular benefits or all. Why is it really difficult? Because these categories, typically LDC, are reevaluated periodically. You see immediately the confusion. Some of them reevaluate every year, but other, let's say the UN, reevaluates, for instance, every 3 years, which means that you have some countries which are in a particular, they change the category every year, but the LDC change every 3 years, IDA change every 3 years, and it is introducing, there is no other one, an absolute mess in the classification of categories. So threshold don't coincide now. WTO, I insist, has also its own classification, which is developing countries with specific benefits, so the famous special and different treatment, etc. What is important is the geopolitical dimension of all this, clear, the overlapping, the different grouping, no coherence. And I found a paper, which is a bit old, by two persons who made a very deep analysis of all this. This is their sentence. What they said, I quote, "This proliferation does not seem induced by any clear rationale, nor any definition of country characteristics, and is driven by geopolitical and bureaucratic motifs." This is in Journal Development Studies. It's so I am almost finished, and so what I say is that may contribute to the dissolution of what are the developing countries, and it is problematic also not only because it's an assault, an attack against scientific, rigorous thinking, you see, but also because economics is based, as already mentioned, on correlation between these categories and other aggregates. That is, the World Bank and the IMF, or even academic journal, don't have any problem to take the database of the IMF on MDs, you see, which is incredibly aggregated and merging carrots and broccoli, and correlate with a particular aggregate. And it becomes an academic paper. That is where MD is, for instance, being an MD, every day like this, is correlated with high indebtedness. That is, suddenly you have a theoretical assertion which is coming from this category, and then you have a model, etc. So now the conclusion that is, okay, all this is interesting, but what is the final, at the end of the day? I mean, empirically speaking, development did not happen. I mean, this is also what is over 1 century. I mean, what is the position of so-called developing economies today? It's even worse in some areas, like in Africa. Even the World Bank used the word great reversal, which is really a bit frightening as a word for Africa. This is the last report, 2024, and stagnation that is in the real world, whatever the feasibility, etc. Nothing happened. Countries are in some areas worse than before, and in fact, the real mechanism is not at all incremental. No, it is really something that César knows very well, because I presented this here 2 years ago. It's much more a cumulative trapping process, which is really a vicious circle. And you see self-perpetuating condition, which is definition of poverty trap. And what is important in this sentence, this is a technical definition for poverty trap, is the end of productive superiority. That is, a concept of superiority, in fact, has completely disappeared in reality. That is, what is a poverty trap? Some poverty that persist over time, I mean, over centuries, and institutions which are persisting despite their lack of efficiency and superiority, which is an absolute necessary. And then the dimension of being superior or inferior explodes completely in this. Okay, so diminished expectation. I think my title was I hope, relevant. And so feasibility rather than teleology. And the conclusion, which I think is a coward conclusion, is just to say that now what to do. That is, it's very French. You have deconstructed the concept in a very French way. And what could be the condition of rebuilding a theological concept? Because I do think that without teleology, that is, where do we go? What could be the desirable state of affairs? Nothing can happen, you see. And what could be the condition of rebuilding and currently the context, international context, is not exactly the best for this necessary task. Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry, and I have to. my best English.